Welcome to today's RUC People, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Janet Giddy, who I think has been part of our church for a few years now. Welcome, Janet. Great to have you.
Thanks, Russell.
So, Janet, let's kick off by telling us a little bit about what you're doing now.
Okay, so right at the moment, I'm working for an organization called Médecins Sans Frontières. We call it MSF. Some people call it Doctors Without Borders. And some people may have heard of it and others not, but they're an international humanitarian organization that actually works in about 60 or 70 countries. So it's really big, and they got very well known during the Ebola time because they rushed off to West Africa and did, field hospitals and things, whilst the WHO was still thinking about what to do. They kind of got there and did. So I've been with MSF since June last year. And I'm working on a drug-resistant TB program that involves community health workers. That's in essence what I'm doing right now.
So you're a medical doctor.
Yes.
And been working in that field for a very long time now, I gather. Can you maybe just take us back a little bit and, even start with how you decided you wanted to be a doctor? What was in your mind there?
Well, it's kind of interesting when you think about what motivates a person in the choice of their career. So if I start with where I'm at now, what's really interesting is, so TB often goes with HIV, and I've worked a lot in the HIV field for many years. My actual kind of specialization, so to speak, is in family medicine. I've got a master's in family medicine and a master's in public health. And this work seems to bring together quite a lot of those threads. But if you think about why we do what we do, is very, very interesting. So one of my hobbies or interests is creative writing. And I was on a writing course about 5 or 6 years ago, and the person who ran the course was a doctor called Dawn Garish, who is a doctor but also a writer, and she's published a lot herself, and she runs these writing courses. And right at the end, she gave this little throwaway comment where she said, just as the course was finishing, she said, "We are often profoundly influenced by the diseases we had in our childhood." And my first thought was, oh, but that doesn't apply to me. I was I've been a very healthy person my whole life. I didn't have any childhood diseases. And about a minute later, I remembered that I'd had TB as a child. And I was about 4 or 5 years old when I got TB. And Dawn saying this to me really made me think a lot. And the first thing I started to do was to try and remember what I could about having TB as a child. And then I went on, and anyway, it led to a very interesting process where I interviewed a whole lot of doctors who'd had TB as adults, and thinking about what it's like to have TB as a doctor in South Africa. And then I went on to think, how did this shape my life? And then I thought, well, it's kind of really interesting. For much of my childhood, I never talked about having TB. For much of my life, I never talked about it. But on some deep level, I thought the fact that I had TB when I was 4 or 5, and the fact that I ended up as a doctor working a lot of my adult life with infectious diseases like HIV and TB, is that a coincidence or not? Surely not. And the other funny thing is, I said I did family medicine and public health as specialities. But when I was a medical student, I had a very bad accident in my 4th year. In fact, when I was walking here for this interview and I was crossing that corner by the Common and Liesbeek Parkway and Belmont Road, I always think every time I cross it that's where I had this really bad accident. And I was on a motorbike and I was hit by a car and I broke both my legs very dramatically in my 4th year. But in that year, in the course of, I had several operations, I missed the whole block of public health and the whole block of family medicine. And everyone said, it doesn't matter, they're not so important, you'll catch that up easily. And I sort of caught it up. Then I thought, well, is it an accident that I ended up specializing in family medicine and public health? So I think the coincidences of life, They're very interesting. And the so-called accidents of life. The Jungians say that nothing happens by accident and there are no coincidences. So I don't think I've really answered your question, but...
Well, growing up, did you consciously decide that you wanted to be a doctor?
I decided at some point, but not for good reasons.
What's a good reason?
Not for those altruistic reasons. Oh, you know, I'm going to find a cure for cancer. I'm going to be a heart surgeon. I'm going to be a brain surgeon. I'm going to do something dramatic. You know, I had a very strange and boring life as a teenager. And I remember being bored for much of my adolescent years. We lived on a farm. My parents didn't believe in indulging their children. And if you went home for the holidays, that was it. 3 weeks you stayed on the farm. You didn't, there was no visiting friends, movies, etc. And I remembered my main feeling as a teenager was, I never want to be bored again. I want to have an interesting job. I want to have the opportunity to travel. And I think medicine could fit the bill. So it was for purely selfish reasons that I originally did medicine. It wasn't a calling. God didn't speak to me. I actually wasn't a Christian at that time. But it was like I was trying to think how I wanted to have agency in my life. I think that's what it was.
Okay. So we'll come back to the career and the way that developed soon, but just tell us a little bit about your childhood and your parents and where you grew up and your family.
So my parents were very eccentric people, which has affected me in quite a lot of ways. And unfortunately, I think there's an eccentric gene in our family, and certainly some of our children have got it to varying degrees of penetration. But, you know, when we designed their gravestone, we made a picture and we put there, you know, that they were very eccentric. So quite alternative. My mother ended up being a very famous international botanist, but she had no qualification in botany. So we used to say she's a botanist QBE, qualified by experience. And she actually studied psychology and anthropology at university, but ended up as a botanist. And she was the first person who put cycads in South Africa on the map. She wrote the first book about cycads. In South Africa, she was an international expert in endangered plants and went to conferences all over the world long before other people I knew were going to conferences. Wow. But we grew up on a farm, as I said.
Whereabouts?
Near Pietermaritzburg. But I was born in the Eastern Cape, and my longest, deepest taproot in the African soil is in the Eastern Cape.
Where in the Eastern Cape?
A place called Berkeley East, which no one has ever heard of unless they've been there, because it's not on the road to anywhere. It's the end of a road, so to speak. It's very high up in the mountains, just below Lesotho. And it's very cold in winter, and it often snows. And my ancestors on my father's side have lived there since the 1870s. They've farmed continuously, some or other, you know, generation, probably 4 or 5 generations now. But on my mother's side, my mother was Afrikaans, my father was English, and of course, back in the 1940s and 50s, those were thought to be different races. Different races, let me tell you, not different ethnicities. When people talk about racial issues, you know, that's a whole topic. But my parents got married, and it was a difficult marriage. But my mum, what I was going to say is my mum comes from an Afrikaans family that stretches back in South Africa to 1688. She was a Tehran, and the original Tehran came to South Africa in 1688. My father's family came in 1830, so really quite recently, relatively speaking. So I feel extremely South African. I feel like I have had, you know, on my mother's side, 10 generations of people living in this country. Yeah. Anyway, I was born in the Eastern Cape, grew up on a farm in KZN. I'm one of 4 girls. I'm the second of 4 girls. And one of my other sisters is a doctor as well. She's the Lat Lameki. She's 8 years younger. And she works in Knysna. And I was just saying to Russell while we were preparing for this talk, she's just set off on her 3rd Camino today. She's just arrived in Spain and will be walking 900 kilometers. I'm a little bit envious.
Yes, and you did that recently. We'll talk about that a bit later as well. Yeah. So grew up on the farm and went to school. Was it a rural school?
In Maritzburg.
In Maritzburg.
A big girls' high, a bit like Rustenburg.
Okay.
Yes. Then went to UCT Medical School, as I said, for somewhat selfish reasons.
So was that a big move for you? I mean, leaving KZN and home to come to Cape Town? You know, was that an escape from?
It was a very exciting and dramatic move, and I wanted to completely reinvent myself. I wanted to come to UCT, and I was so pleased no one knew about my eccentric parents. My father used to walk around Maritzburg with no shoes on and barefooted, and they did all sorts of things that were slightly strange, and many people knew them, and I wanted to be somewhere where no one had ever heard of Ted and Cynthia Giddy. And to be honest, I was quite happy to be away from my sisters as well.
Okay. So new life in Cape Town, a new identity. And how did you find UCT? And obviously studying medicine, it's a long course, 6 years, something like that?
Yes. Well, I mean, medical school is not difficult. For anyone who wants to know, I don't think you have to be that clever to be a doctor. You have to be do well and have good marks to get into medical school, but it's not really difficult. It's just quite a lot of work, and actually I think you've got to be very clever to do a lot of other courses like, I don't know what, actuarial science and chemical engineering and things like that. Philosophy. I had a wonderful first year, and I got this lovely boyfriend. I couldn't believe my luck. Like, I landed this real catch, this Michael House boy, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, gorgeous. And I thought, wow, for a little farm girl who never seen the world much, this is not bad going. And his name was Steve Reed, and how we met is an interesting story, but too long.
Well, I think he's still on the scene, this Mr. Steve Reed, isn't he?
Yes, he is. He is still on the scene. Yes. Professor Steve Reed now. I professed at the medical school. Well, his father was a medical professor, so he's kind of followed in the line in a way.
Wonderful. So,
but I have to tell you something, Russell, about going to university. So first year was a wonderful year, and I was very happy. And in second year, I crashed. I had a severe, in retrospect now, looking back, I would say, well, the actual car crash, the crash with the legs, well, that was in fourth year. But I had an emotional / spiritual / existential crash in second year. And it was like I had everything, and everything was going well, and there was no problem. But I became, in retrospect, looking back, very depressed. And I think at the time, I didn't understand depression, and fortunately, no one took me off to see a psychologist or a GP who put me on medication and said, there, dear, you'll be fine if you just take your pills. I think I really struggled through a whole lot of stuff. And I think depression is a very interesting condition. Again, I won't get into that. But I think it's often a way in which we start to process something very deep. And for me, it was a spiritual searching that got triggered by that episode. And that's actually when I became a Christian. So I came from a very nominally Christian family, like very nominally, barely. I mean, if they went to church once a year at Easter or Christmas, it was a lot, but generally not. And there was no talk of God in our family or anything. So for me, becoming a Christian was a very profound thing. And that happened in my second year when I was 19 years old.
And like you said, you suffered depression, but that doesn't automatically lead people to faith. I mean, was there a church connection somewhere? I mean, what do you think took you in that, in the faith, why did the depression catalyze you towards faith and Christian faith?
Yeah, because I think what happens, I think even the word depression, maybe it wasn't only that. It was some sort of personal crisis. And I started asking myself the question, what is the meaning of life? And I think when you ask those deep questions, you can go in a number of different directions. But I feel like God directly intervened, because I remember one day feeling a bit desperate and despairing, and I just felt something in me saying, go and talk to that person, Lindy X, let me call her. And Lindy X was a girl in Res, I was in Fuller Hall, by the way, who I didn't particularly like, but I sort of knew she was a Christian. And I didn't feel drawn to her as a person, but something in me said, go and talk to Lindy X. I knocked on her door and I said, can I just talk to you? And she obviously recognized that this was a sort of spiritual searching, and she sort of directed me, and things like that happened, So I don't know how much was internal and how much was external, how much was God sort of directing my life at that time.
I mean, that's some pretty profound things happening all around that time. You found a vocation, you found a husband, a life partner, and found faith.
No, but I didn't think I'd found a husband, because when I came out of this depressive time, and I felt like I was more together, and I decided many things about life and myself and what was important, values and priorities. And I shared very little of this with Steve.
Yes.
But when I came out of it all, I said to him, we were on holiday. It was the June holiday. This started sort of a few weeks into my second year, which is, of course, the year when you do dissection and all those things, which I think for many people, it suddenly becomes very real. And a lot of people, I think, struggle in second year. But anyway, we got to the June holiday and I was feeling fine. And I said to Steve, on a walk in a forest, I said to him, you know, Steve, I've been going through a bit of a difficult time. I don't think he realized. I think it sort of passed him by, or I couldn't communicate it. And he said, yeah. And I said, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling fine now. I said, I just want to tell you, if I don't want you to be in this relationship for any reason except that you want to be in it and not because you feel sorry for me. So if you want to, this is your time to leave the relationship. I was like giving him an exit strategy because I was questioning everything. And I wondered what the relationship meant to him. And he said to me, no. I like having you for a girlfriend. So I said, okay, that's nice. And I thought that could have left it at that. And that was all I was expecting. And then he went on and he said, but I don't think I'm ever going to marry you. And I thought, I didn't ask you for that. This was not me trying to ask for a proposal of marriage. So I was so shocked I didn't say a word. And then I stepped on it. And the next day, I gathered myself on another walk. And I said, Steve, why did you say that about you're not going to marry me? So he said, well, thought about it, but for a split second. And he said, because I've always thought I'm going to marry somebody like my mother. And of course, that shut me up completely. There was nothing more to say. And his mother, and the sort of person she is, and imagining herself as a person of my age, was the complete opposite of me. And anyway, so for the next few years, I harbored no expectations. I just thought this is a medical school romance. And when it comes to an end, that's that. And actually, when I got to the end of medical school, I ended up a year ahead of Steve because he took a year out to do a BSc. So I was graduating and I had to apply for an intern's post. And so I applied for one at Giddy, one at Cecilia Makawani in the Eastern Cape, and one in Durban at King Edward Hospital, which I was least likely to get, and one in Namibia. And I didn't get the Namibian one, but I got all the others. I got offered a post. So I said to Steve, who was still my boyfriend after all these years, and he was now in his not quite final year. I said, Steve, which of these posts do you think I should take for my internship? He said, whichever one you want. So I thought, okay, so he's not saying stay in Cape Town. So I thought, I'll go as far as possible of these posts I've got. So I took the job in Durban, which was very, very interesting. And I went off and did my internship in Durban. And halfway through that year, we somehow realized we actually did feel like we belonged together, and we decided to get married, to my complete shock and surprise, given that discussion in second year.
Well, it sounds like Durban sort of put it to the test a bit, and, you know, we knew that it was serious.
Yeah, well, various things, but it was a very long, drawn-out, so to speak, courtship, that old-fashioned word. Yeah. And then I think what happened after that was kind of interesting. Getting married to Steve became the defining event of my life. And I always thought I was not really that sort of person. I was very independent. But actually, if I look at much of our life and where we ended up, it was shaped by being married to Steve Reed. And so the first big shaping happened when he had the military service thing. And in those days, it was we got married at the end of 1984. And in 1985, he was doing his internship and he got his call-up papers, and it had been put off for years, what to do about the military. And in those days, all white men, it was compulsory, they had to go to the army. So we'd been through a whole thing with friends and people in the church. I was in Cape Town. I ended up living in a Christian community with quite, for that time, radical Christian people. Paul Jamont and various other people, including, and I didn't live with Steve DeGrucci, but he visited the house a lot. But he never really spoke to me very much. He spoke to the more Christian intellectuals, and I was obviously just not quite in the same category, but anyway. So we had talked a lot about the military issue all through the student days, and when the time came, Steve knew he wasn't going to go to the army. And we considered leaving the country, and we went and looked in Zimbabwe. We did a whole kind of reconnaissance trip. We thought of living in some of the sort of corners of South Africa that was supposedly independent, like the Ciskei or whatever. We thought about going to another country. My mother-in-law was urging us, darlings, you must go, you must go. You can't possibly stay in this country. It is too dangerous. And there's no future. There is no future. And if you have children, there's no future. So anyway, we thought about it, we talked about it, we prayed about it, and Steve felt the right thing was to object. So he applied to be a conscientious objector. He went through the whole process. And the law had changed, which made it possible to be a conscientious objector without going to jail, whereas before, if you objected, you just went to jail. But you had to meet quite strict criteria, and if you were accepted, you had to work, you had to do 6 years of what they called community service. So that's what happened. Steve was allocated 6 years, and we decided to do it in a rural hospital. So we went, they didn't really like that, and there was quite a bit of a fight about that, because the rural hospital was right up on the border of Swaziland and Mozambique, and at that time, South Africa was fighting a war in those countries, and, well, in a covert way. So they didn't want people at the border, and the border was very militarized. I mean, we used to go through roadblocks. There were soldiers, there were sandbags in the road. But anyway, we fought a legal process to be, we went to the hospital before the allocation came through, and then it was like they had to move us. And then we dug in like, you know, like those poor Ukrainians are digging in.
Yes.
And we dug in and we got legal help, and in the end, and I was about to have our first baby, in the end they allowed us to stay reluctantly, and obviously they must have told local people to keep an eye on us. But we, in the end, spent 10 years at this rural hospital in the far northeast of KZN, a hospital called Bethesda, in a place called Ubambo, and we still actually have a stone house there. We've retained a link with that area. And whilst we were there, we had 4 children.
All born in that
10
10-year period, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And were you working at the same time?
So I had to work because Steve, as a conscientious objector, earned 500 Rand a month, which nowadays feels like it doesn't even fill up a quarter of a shopping trolley. But even in those days, 500 Rand was not really enough money to live on. We got some rations from the kitchen as a sort of some weird kind of deal. We got a box of sort of rations once a week. But apart from that, 500 Rand a month for 6 years. So,
and 4 extra mouths to feed.
Children coming along. So I was a working mum. And I think that my whole working life as a mother was defined by the fact that I felt I didn't have a choice. Of course, one always has a choice. You know, you could do things differently. But it felt to me I didn't have a choice, and that I had to work partly to support us as a family, but also because the hospital, as rural hospitals do, waxes and wanes in the staffing, and they were sometimes very, very short-staffed. And the longer you stay there, the more you become the experienced senior doctors. And so it felt difficult to not work. And so I did work the whole time. After a few years, I did stop doing night calls, and I adjusted my work hours a little bit as the children came along. But what was amazing, it was actually the most definitive and significant thing that shaped our whole lives as individuals and professionally. And actually, Steve went on, and when we moved to Durban, and he realized that rural health and rural medicine was a completely ignored and neglected area professionally. You know, they used to say this thing, who goes to rural hospital, the mad, the bad, and the sad, and all the missionaries. And there were a lot of Christians working in rural hospitals, and the hospital we were in was an ex-mission hospital with a very strong Christian ethos. But when we went back to Durban after 10 years, Steve decided rural medicine needed to be, the profile needed to be raised, it needed to be kind of, at the medical schools and the academic world, people needed to take it more seriously. And with others, and with linking with international people, he became part of a whole movement to mainstream rural medicine. And he was actually appointed the first professor of rural medicine in South Africa a few years later. So it really has defined his career very profoundly, and our lives as well, and my life as well. And often when I'm going through something difficult and things seem really tough, I think to myself, well, we've been through worse at Bethesda. You know, it was like
sort of
all the difficult
point.
things of life. Yes, if I could cope with that, I can cope with anything. You know, lack of water, lack of electricity, lack of drugs, lack of this, lack of that. You know, not having things, having to make do. Just, I mean, one can tell a lot of stories about, and any rural doctor, when you get together, we all vie for our stories of extreme experiences, of which there are many.
So, you know, that was your, as you say, baptism of fire almost, you know, working mother, many things lacking, you know, financially, just struggling along, trying to balance career with home responsibilities. How did that continue for you? I mean, were you, you know, you talked about how, you know, there was more definition coming to Steve's career and his role with rural medicine. Was that parallel with you? I mean, as you considered how your, you know, career as a doctor would evolve, did you have a sense of where that was moving?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like I say, so much of my life has been defined by the choice I made to marry this man. And yet I feel like God has also had his hand over my career and my life. And I've had a very, very interesting career, quite separately to Steve's, and whilst trying to fit my life around his. It's like, I think God has had a plan and a purpose for my life. And so while we were at the rural hospital, we both specialized in family medicine at a distance. There was a distance-based program. And we both in the end ended up teaching on that course through Medunsa, the medical school in north of Pretoria.
Yeah.
And when we came to Durban, we both worked at McCord Hospital, which was a Christian hospital, one of the last kind of overtly Christian hospitals in South Africa. And I think it was really, for me, very interesting. I think throughout our work, we've worked in situations where we've worked with Christians in the rural hospital as well as at McCord Hospital. And that whole idea of Christians being active in their faith, in their work, in the world was always not a struggle. I think the most difficult thing was for Steve being at UCT, which is a very secular humanist environment. It's much harder to be an active, obvious Christian in that environment than in many of the other work environments that we found ourselves in. But anyway, whilst in Durban, Steve's career was going in that academic direction. I worked for a year. We moved out of town. We lived in Durban for 5 years. Then we moved to a sort of more countryish area called Hillcrest. And it was close to an area called the Valley of 1,000 Hills. And I got a job there because I didn't want to commute into town. And the children were all at schools. And I felt like being a mum and working was quite a challenge. So I got a job working for the Department of Health in the Valley of 1,000 Hills. And it was one of the most difficult, and probably the most difficult job I've ever had, because I realized the only doctor working in a clinic system between Durban and Maritzburg, and there was a population of about 500,000 people. And it was 1999, 2000, and it was the height of the HIV epidemic. And
that particular area was almost the epicenter.
KZN, absolutely, the so-called epicenter. And I remember one day, sort of being completely overwhelmed by HIV, having no resources. I wrote a piece about it called HIV and Hope, just describing the experiences. We didn't have any antiretrovirals. Every single day, these very emaciated, sick people brought into the consulting room. I would look desperately for a diagnosis of TB because there was a TB hospital nearby. And if I could diagnose TB, of course, many of them did have TB. And there was a bed in the TB hospital and they could be admitted. They could live a little bit longer, but ultimately, of course, they died as well. And I was totally overwhelmed by this tsunami of death, really, of dying patients. And I remember just feeling totally desperate. And I had a boss who was very, very unsupportive. I never ever saw him. He worked at a peri-urban big community health center. Never once in that year did he ever reach out or support me. I tried to get other support. I think, completely burnt out, but not so much because of the work, but just the lack of support and the undermining and the challenges. And I had a real sort of a very low moment. And I remember thinking to myself, I never really want to work with HIV patients again. I just can't do this anymore. It's just too much. Mm. And I went back to McCord Hospital, and I thought I'd rather commute, and it was a safer space, and I got a job partly at the medical school. And oh, by the way, with that job, I left the job, but I actually sued the Department of Health for what's called constructive dismissal. If anyone has ever known anything about constructive dismissal, it's like you leave a job because you're almost being forced to leave it. Mm. And I actually won the case, which was quite a triumph. And with the money, I bought a carpet. I bought a Persian carpet because I wanted to walk on Dr. Mbele every single day because he was this nemesis of mine. It was like a really funny thing. But anyway, I went back to McCord's. I gathered myself a little bit. I got a job partly at the medical school, and I realized I could have chosen a career in medical education because Steve was now at the medical school, and I had a very interesting time, and I thought I could do medical education. I'd done a lot of teaching by then, and I thought, I'll do this. And then I was offered a job to head up the HIV program at McCord Hospital at the beginning of 2003. And I applied for it, and I thought I told myself I never want to work with HIV patients again. But something in me also, the things that affect us most profoundly and disturb us the most profoundly also call us. So again, going back to the original idea, no such thing as a coincidence. Everything happens for a reason. That difficult year happened for a reason. So I took on the job at McCord Hospital of heading up the HIV programs, which at that time were kind of interesting. There was something happening that wasn't happening anywhere else. We had some patients on antiretrovirals as a result of a drug trial, and we had some patients who could afford to pay, and we were looking for ways to find cheaper antiretrovirals. So there was some hope, whereas in my previous job, you had HIV, that's it, no treatment. Here, there were HIV patients, and we could help some of them. And actually, that's when I first linked with MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, because they had started this big HIV program in Cape Town. And all the little small projects all over South Africa, like our McCord project, like MSF, like a few others, came together to form an organization to try and buy cheap drugs, buy them or smuggle them or anything from Brazil, India, wherever we could get them. People were bringing in suitcases of ARVs, and we wanted to be in on that. And so that's when I first met TAC, Treatment Action Campaign, MSF people, Francois Fenter, various other people. But anyway, being at McCord Hospital, it was the most extraordinary thing. It was like being at the right place, at the right time. It was on the cusp of a wave which was the ARV wave. And through McCord's and my work there, we linked with a lot of very wealthy, powerful Americans. We got PEPFAR funding. We were suddenly awash in money, and we could really run with treating people with HIV with ARVs. So having come from that desperate situation, it was suddenly the floodgates open. And I think that's often how God works in our lives. We go through these desperate moments, these, what do you call them, desert experiences, times of wilderness, of feeling abandoned by God, or what's God doing? And then this time of abundance.
I mean, that's a hugely significant period in South Africa's history, and you're right at the forefront of that. So, Janet,
we went from, I'd been there a few months, and we went to a sort of mini conference in HIV, and they asked us to count how many patients we had in ARVs, and we counted the folders at that time, and we had about 100 patients on ARVs. 7 or 8 years later, we had 10,000 patients we'd started in ARVs. It was just, the order of magnitude was unbelievable.
So tell us how you found your way to Cape Town.
Well, once again, this theme.
Yes.
That husband. Following that husband. Steve always got a bit restless before me. He's always been restless in a strange way. So, and we'd been told many years ago by a very famous obstetrician, Professor Philpott, when I was a very young doctor. He said to me, Janet, you need a major change in your work life about every 7 years. And looking at Professor Philpott's life, that was true. So I'd had a bit over 7 years with the HIV program, but I wasn't ready to go. I was like having my best time ever, which is a really, really fascinating life at that time. But Steve felt something was coming to an end in his life, and he applied for a job in Cape Town. And well, initially he was a bit reluctant, but then something in him made him apply. And he got a job as a professor of primary healthcare at UCT, and he started at the beginning of 2010. And I moved a few months later, and we came to Cape Town.
Mm. And so you've been here ever since?
Yes, that's 12 years.
And so what have you been doing in Cape Town professionally?
Well, at the beginning, I decided I didn't really want a job. I was, in a way, still quite connected to that McCord job, and I went back regularly as a consultant.
Mm.
And by then, we developed, apart from all the patients on treatment, with American money comes American researchers and American research. So we developed a huge research program, and I was still quite involved with that, and I headed up the Research Ethics Committee. So when we first came to Cape Town, I went back and forth to Durban, and I was also finding my feet and just not really necessarily wanting to find a job. I think I was still processing and letting go of, that felt like the biggest job of my life, that Durban HIV job. And I was sort of just a little bit in between, sort of, what did you call it, liminal space. Some people call it a chrysalis time, where you sort of evolving into something else, or not quite sure what. And then actually through RUC, to be honest, so let me quickly tell you why I ended up coming to RUC.
Yes.
So when we first came to Durban, to Cape Town, see, I think I still live in Durban. When we first came to Cape Town, we ended up as a family, sort of, we are a bit of a sort of, not always pulling in the same direction family, to be honest. We're all a bit too ruggedly individualistic. So we all were in different churches. So I was going to Jubilee because we had some friends in Jubilee. One of our children was going to Common Ground. And our oldest son, Luke, he is the serious eccentric in the family. He was coming to RUC.
I remember he was coming to Sundays at Belmont a few times.
Yes. And so Luke was coming here. And one Sunday when we were all getting ready to go off to different churches, I thought, this is crazy. I think we need to come to, consolidate these different churches. And I thought I couldn't insist they came to Jubilee, because I think they wouldn't really like that church, because they'd been to a church a bit like that in Hillcrest and they hadn't really liked it. So I thought, well, I'd better try their churches. And also I was trying to be a different sort of mother, where I didn't sort of say, come on, guys, follow me. I was like trying to be more sort of in tune with adult children and fitting with their lives. So I went for one Sunday to Common Ground, and I thought, no, this doesn't really do it for me. So I thought, well, let me come to RUC with Luke. And so I started coming to RUC, and I've been here ever since, which would have been about, not the first year I was here, maybe 2011 or something. And at RUC, I met Carol Craig. And Carol Craig is also an HIV TB doctor, and she knew me, we didn't know each other, but we knew more of each other through the HIV work. And she said to me, what are you doing? And I told her, and I said, but I don't have a serious job. I'm fine, I don't need one right now. And she said, no, I think we should find you a job. So she took me off, and she persuaded me that I needed to have a job with the Western Cape Department of Health, doing something HIV related. And at that point, when I thought about HIV, and at McCord's, we'd had a whole series of different parts of our HIV program. We had a child program, an adult program, a prevention of mother-to-child transmission program, which works with pregnant women and children, PMTCT. We had a program for people who were basically dying, the Lazarus ones, the ones everyone had given up on, but we could see if we could kind of get them up and going. There were all these different parts of the program and the research. And when I thought about it, I said to Carol, I've done all this HIV work, but actually the thing I like the most and that interests me the most is the working with the pregnant women, the PMTCT. She said, just the thing. There's going to be a job in Khayelitsha. We need a PMTCT program coordinator, manager or something. And she somehow arranged, and before I could think twice, I had a job in Khayelitsha with the Western Cape Department of Health, with Carol Craig's team doing PMTCT, which I started with. But
for those who don't know what PMTCT,
prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. Basically, it's pregnant women who can pass it on to their children, either through pregnancy, birth, or breastfeeding. Yes. So I started off doing that, and within a year or two, I realized that PMTCT doesn't work well if it's only located in an HIV paradigm. You actually have to think about maternal and child health services. So if you think of two intersecting circles, I used to draw this diagram, there's HIV on one, maternal and child health on the other, and in the middle is PMTCT. And I found myself moving more and more into maternal and child health. And I always kept up a certain amount of PMTCT activities, but the PMTCT program was very, very exciting, but then we got everything we wanted. Everything we were fighting for, we got. And in the end, we had this incredible program, and we employed other people, and we were able to reduce the transmission rate. PMTCT is one of the great HIV success stories. Could reduce transmission from mother to child from somewhere between 30 and 40% down to less than 1%. And you could measure it. That's the thing. It's measurable, because you tested the children and see how many are not positive. So then I went into maternal and child health, largely, where I sort of kept about 20% of my time for PMTCT and the rest maternal and child health. And I had a wonderful time doing maternal and child health. And I got involved in a campaign called The First 1,000 Days, which became a huge passion of mine. It bored everyone who knew me silly, especially my family. It's like, you could see the minute she starts talking about the first 1,000 days, it's like, oh, please, give us a break.
Wonderful. So there's been lots of very exciting professional developments through your life. But just tell us a little bit more about Janet outside of work and motherhood. And you mentioned before the Camino walk, but what else do you love to do? I mean, maybe tell us a little bit about that. I know you did that 2 or 3 years ago in Spain, and that was very exciting. But tell us about some other things that you like to do just for fun.
Yes, for fun. I do. The older I get, the more I like to do things for fun. And I have decided I've got to that age where for, many people, some dread disease suddenly comes knocking at your door.
Yes.
Or doesn't come knocking at your door, you just die. Like there's a guy called Paul Farmer, who's exactly the same age as me, who's a global health international superstar, and who's very involved with the HIV work. And for anyone who follows those kinds of things, they would have read. Paul Farmer was found dead in his bed in Rwanda at the age of 62, which is the age I am, a few months ago. Like you go to bed and then you just don't wake up. So my feeling is we've got to have as much fun as possible before and even after we diagnosed with cancer, because I had that diagnosis 18 months ago, but I'm fine.
Good.
And so I take opportunities. So what do I do for fun? I travel, and in the last few years, I've had some wonderful trips and travels to many parts of the world. My particular favorite is India, where Steve and I have done quite a lot of work-related traveling, and I found India a fascinating country. Our children have ended up in different parts of the world, and one of our sons was in Asia for about almost 10 years, so I visited Asia quite a bit. And COVID, of course, means we can't travel. In fact, I think the last trip I did was overseas, was the Camino in 2019, which was a wonderful several 100-kilometer walk in the north of Spain that I loved. But I like walking, and I like writing, as I said. So I do a lot of writing. And
what kind of writing?
Well, there's what I call technical writing and personal writing. So technical writing is more, all those reports and proposals and things that I've had to do over many years. But what's interesting, I was given a job when I started this job with MSF, the DRTB job, where they said, please write an article about the history of this program. Well, they're not going to get an article. They're going to get a long report, a very long piece, because I've started writing that story. So I quite like medical history. One of the jobs I've done in the last few years, my job at the Department of Health that I mentioned that I enjoyed very much, came to a rather abrupt end in a very strange way. But as I choose to do nowadays, I feel everything happens for a reason. I feel like God brought that season to an abrupt end, and it gave me time to have a different season, a more sabbatical season, more writing, reflecting. And so one of the writing projects, I've been writing a history of McCord Hospital, the hospital I worked at, focusing a lot on the HIV work. So it's also been a way of processing what I experienced as a practitioner with two historians. So I'm interested, and Steve, my husband, is also very interested in something called medical humanities, which is the overlap between medicine and the humanities. So that's could be history, music, art. He's particularly interested in music, anthropology, philosophy, whatever. But I'm interested in medical history. So I've done quite a lot of medical history writing, but I also do my own personal writing. I'm writing this family story of these ancestors that go back to 1688, writing about rural hospital experiences. So I think my big interest is writing, and I like to cook and go for walks and mosaicing. I do quite a lot of mosaicing. Spend a lot of time with friends, and I'm trying to be quite an active grandmother. So we have one grandchild who's 4 years old, and there's another one due anytime, any day this month. Our daughter, Joanna, who's also a doctor, is in Joburg, and so I'm just expecting the call, and then I'm going to book the flight and go to Joburg to meet my second grandchild.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Janet. It's been fascinating to hear something of your story. A lot of life to fit into a short space of time, but you've just given us a snapshot, I think, and that's been wonderful. And it's great to have you here at RUC. And But
I want to say one last thing, Russell. I don't think my life would be what it was if it weren't for God. I feel like that's the thread that connects everything.
Yes.
And the things that seem to make no sense, or the times of suffering, or the difficulties, or the challenges, I feel God has been there through it all. It feels like I would not be here, and I would not be me, would not have had these experiences but for God. So I have to say that.
You know, you've spoken on many points during this interview about the sense of a plan, of a direction, and that there was a purpose.
Despite that man.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Janet.